Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Buku Sayisa wash processed Ethiopia from Momos Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Momos, based out of Busan, South Korea, and they were originally a suggestion to us by Ethiopia. So once again, shout out to and thank you to Ed for the suggestion. This is Momo's second ever appearance on this channel, as we recently reviewed the El Cedrel, a honey processed Costa Rican coffee. And when making this purchase, this is the coffee I definitely had my eye on, as I expected to like this one the most. And I have liked a lot of Buku Sayisa coffees in the past. It's definitely going to be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 33. And recipe we went with for this coffee was actually no recipe, because I liked this one best through the automatic coffee maker. But I was trying this coffee a lot with the same recipe that we brewed the last one with, which is a 16.67 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And as mentioned, I definitely did prefer the automatic coffee maker for this one. Now, roast profile is also definitely on the more developed side of things. I would say that it's slightly less developed than the previous coffee we'd reviewed from Momos at El Cedrel. Even then, it was definitely still a fair bit on the more developed side of things, so I would still call this one a true medium in terms of that roast profile. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and the cup immediately skewed in the direction of a fresh fruit profile, as it did have a lively citrus right from the start. There was an almost classic peach-like and floral-like characteristic to it. However, I did have to note that there was a more developed quality to the cup as well. Even then, it did feel a little well-rounded, as that kind of came a little bit more secondary as opposed to the El Cedrel, where it was right at the forefront. So a little bit of a decent start. We continue on to day 16, where I ran it through the Chemex, and at this time I noticed a bunch more of those roasty characteristics, as it was a pretty developed cup of coffee. Notable, as there's a roasty characteristic being the most dominant aspect, with a slightly more heavy body than initially expected. There's a wonderful peachiness still buried underneath, but at this time it became a lot more secondary to those earlier wonderful floral and fruity qualities. Day 18, ran it through the April dripper, and the cup continues to remain a little bit on the positive side of things underneath those smoky qualities. So something I'd kind of mentioned with that El Cedrel, as it does continue to have a little bit of that peachy aspect with a sparkling florality, giving this coffee a little bit of a classic washed Ethiopian coffee feel. However, it's at this point where the coffee did become a little bit more tricky, as on day 21, I attempted the same adjustments I did with the El Cedrel, ran it through the V60 with lower temperatures, and the positivity wasn't quite as nice with this adjustment, as there were a lot more of those smoky qualities and a slightly cleaner base for that peach characteristic. But even then, the entire cup felt a little less lively. So it's one of those things, I've had this happen in the past with more developed coffees, where it's a trade-off of maybe toning down some of those qualities worth what you're experiencing in terms of the lack of vibrancy. And in this case, I didn't necessarily feel that way, because yes, on the earlier days, it did have a lot of smoky characteristics to it, but it was kind of worth the trade-off of the fresh fruit characteristics. At this time, it wasn't quite the same, as I wasn't really getting a whole lot of anything, and in addition to that, there was this slightly harsh woody savoriness that was giving this coffee overall some kind of mixed impressions. So day 23, I attempted the same thing, this time running it through the Chemex, and once again I was feeling a lot of the developed qualities. So I think what really happened was I assumed that the adjustments to this coffee would really kind of yield some positive results, but in reality it was just kind of toning down a lot of the coffee in general. And I was going past the peak for this coffee, because more developed coffees do tend to have an earlier shelf life to them. And in this case, this one seemed to have maybe peaked on the earlier days, because even with the adjustments after this day 23 mark, it didn't necessarily improve. But going back to this, still a very smoky cup, tricky differentiating a lot of the adjustments that I've made and a lot of the flavor profiles within it. Zesty citric quality is still there, but that's about the extent of what I'm experiencing, smoky and citric. Day 26, back through the previous recipe for the day 16 mark to see if maybe I could get some more things from this coffee, but even then it continued to accentuate a lot of those roasty qualities. So I went back to our original recipe to see if maybe I might be able to get that balance back with a lot of that roasty smoky quality, in addition to a lot of those fresh fruit. However, at this time it still just continued to remain a little bit more robust and savory, while losing out on a lot of those fresh fruit aspects. Day 28, continued to struggle with this coffee, as I kind of chalked this one up to maybe my water being an issue, because my water is actually intended for lighter profiled coffees, and typically when I do try to brew more developed coffees in general, it doesn't necessarily work out too well, as I know my water is too soft for these things. And maybe it was too late for me to make the adjustments, but given that there were a couple of days where I had some really positive impressions, I thought that maybe I could still kind of salvage it with maybe some adjustments from the recipe or maybe some adjustments with the grind. That was an error on my behalf because I just felt towards the end that it was really my water that didn't necessarily help with this coffee. Continues to remain robust. The bergamot started to feel a little bit more apt, as I could say there was an herbal citric quality to it. They do have a bergamot note listed on here, but other than that, there isn't too much that's in the cup that's overly defined. And day 30, final notes we have, ran it through the automatic coffee maker, and this seemed to help the most, as it was most reminiscent of the earlier days of this coffee, as it reduced a lot of these smoky qualities to it. I also did change up the water for this one to a little bit more harder of a water. Most defining aspect was this herbal citric bergamot quality, and the slight peachiness and florality were back, not necessarily in huge abundance, but definitely more vibrant than they had been through the previous couple of times we had brewed this coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And 2 level 4s, so let's go through those real quick, and we'll start with the finish. Level 4. It's kind of the same thing that I had mentioned with the other coffee we reviewed from Momos. It doesn't necessarily have the most lasting finish, but it does have that smoky quality to it, which does give the coffee a little bit more of a duration in terms of that finish. So even though it might be on the lower side of the level 4 and I contemplated putting it at the level 3, it still definitely reached that mark, mostly due to the smoky quality that was present within it. Citrus, level 4. Yes, I think by the end I was able to get a little bit more definition within that part of this coffee. As mentioned, there's a bergamot note listed on here. On the earlier days, it was slightly more sweet, but I think maybe towards the end it was getting a little bit more definition, skewing a little bit more in terms of that herbal sense, which is typically the best way I can identify a bergamot, as it's just a little bit different from maybe something like a lime. We have a handful of level 3s. We'll start with the cleanliness level 3. Same thing, this is a wash processed Ethiopian coffee, and as I mentioned in that El Sidrel review, one of the things I was really looking for when it comes to coffees that should have a washed Ethiopian quality is of course going to be the clarity, and I'm not necessarily saying that this one had any sort of natural-like characteristics to it. Once again, what's hindering this coffee is the development, the smoky quality to it, as I feel like if I'm getting too much of that smokiness, then I can't necessarily push it above that level 3 mark, so that's why it's there at that level 3. Sweetness level 3, once again, something else I want to give Momos credit for, because this one still reached that level 3 mark. There were times where it may have been pushing it to get it all the way up there to that level 3, as it just really focused and emphasized a lot of those roastier qualities to the cup. But towards the end, I would say that some of the adjustments and that final time brewing it did seem to yield at least a positive sweetness to the cup. Acidity level 3, once again, kind of surprised by how high the brightness is given the roast profile of this coffee. Don't think I necessarily have too much to say on that. Florality, level 3. Yes, I briefly kind of mentioned the florality, but once again, I'm not going to get a ton of definition to the florality, as it's kind of hard for me to pull out that florality when it has so many of the roasty qualities right at the start of that, because what you're tasting afterwards is a little bit marred by that smokiness to the cup. So don't necessarily have a great descriptor for that, but I definitely felt a fair bit of it. In addition to that, a spice quality to it, which again goes in line with the savory aspect, which is also at a level 3. So don't have too much to say on that either. Stone fruit level 3, I mentioned on the earlier days I was able to pull out some peachy-like qualities to it, which is a characteristic of Buku Sayisa coffees. And even though they don't have that note listed on here, it's something that I was very happy to pull out from that first couple of impressions, and then towards the end when I was able to get it again. Best part of this coffee for me, even if it wasn't necessarily an overly pronounced peachiness. Smokiness level 3. Yes, this is with a lot of work, and I do have to say that anything else other than the automatic coffee maker in which I brewed this coffee, it would reach that level 4 mark. Those handful of days where I was really struggling with this coffee, it reached that level 4 mark. Even though it felt slightly less developed than the Costa Rican coffee, it at the same time really was a little bit more difficult to brew. Once again, attributing that to some of the stuff that I was using to brew this coffee, but nonetheless, it is a slightly more developed coffee. Bitterness, level 3, once again, that's that coffee bitterness. And then the savoriness, yes, a little bit of a darker savory aspect. And I think, once again, the only thing left worth discussing is the body at a level 2. And I said in the earlier days that it had a little bit more body than I expected, and that was mostly when I was brewing it through the V60. Interestingly enough, I did add a little bit more water to maybe hopefully dilute this coffee down when brewing it through the automatic coffee maker, and that probably did play a role on where the body finished in this one. But I think for the most part, this is a pretty good representation of what I was experiencing from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, I was kind of surprised to find out that I would like this one a little less than the Costa Rican coffee, because I did find some redeeming qualities to that Costa Rican coffee. And what really kind of put me off of this one was just how tricky it was to brew for me to get it to a point in which I was really liking the coffee. Oftentimes it's a little frustrating when right at the start you experience a lot of positives from a coffee and for whatever reason you can't seem to replicate it even when you go back to the original adjustments you had for that coffee. And that just made this one a little bit more tricky to brew, which is kind of interesting to me because in theory I would have felt that this one would be the easier of the coffees to brew. But that wasn't necessarily the case, so this one wasn't necessarily my favorite, but once again we're working with a roast profile and a type of coffee that I typically don't work with a lot and typically isn't my type of profile. So we'll just kind of chalk it up to that, and also it's on me because I didn't really have the stuff and equipment to make this coffee the type of coffee I did want it to be. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, yet again, I'm pointing you in the direction of somebody that likes the more developed coffees because this one had a fair bit of that as well. Did have some nice classic Ethiopian qualities, especially when you were able to pull them out. That of course being that citric quality, that peachy quality, so those fresh fruits were really nice. Even then a fair bit of savoriness to it, and I think that's just kind of the best direction I have for this coffee. And maybe somebody, once again, that doesn't necessarily love a lot of brightness, but that's just the best way I'll be able to point somebody towards this coffee and kind of the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you enjoyed the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. And this right here has been a review of the Buku Sayisa, wash processed Ethiopia from Momos Coffee. Thank you for watching.